everybody, this is Hammer Striker here. Today I have a Stoeger Cougar chambered in 45 ACP. This gun is basically identical to the Beretta Cougar. Beretta bought Benelli and they also bought Stoeger, and when they discontinued the Cougar line and replaced it with the PX4, they transferred all of the equipment over to Turkey, the same equipment they'd used to manufacture it originally under the Beretta name, and transitioned the manufacturing over to the Stoeger name. So overall, as far as the equipment, the design, the specs, and everything else, this is the equivalent of a Beretta Cougar manufactured by Stoeger. This gun is, that service pistol type of gun, but it is a compact version of that, so it's a little bit smaller, both in all dimensions. So let me go ahead and show you a few things about this gun. We'll start out by showing you that it is clear. As I mentioned, this one is chambered in 45 ACP. It uses these steel magazines. The capacity is 8 rounds. It does come from Beretta with black plastic grips, and we replaced those grips with these Hogue aluminum grips. And you take this very black gun and these very red grips, and it makes a very nice combination. These are a little bit slipperier than the factory grips. The factory grips have a nice grip texture on them that make them really easy to hold on to. But with the checkering on the front and the checkering on the back, I have no problem holding on to this, firing it, and even my hands get a little bit sweaty. It's easy to maintain a grip on this. A few of the characteristics of this: number one, it does have a Picatinny rail at the front, so you can put a light or a laser on it. It is a DAO/SAO hammer-fired gun. So we'll start out with it in the decocked position. It starts out, it has a very long and actually quite heavy, though smooth, double action pull. The single action pull on it, as you would expect, has a little bit of take up and then an extremely short, crisp break. From a reset perspective, of course, this doesn't behave like a striker-fired gun. If you were to choose to fire it in double action only mode, when you'd go through that long, hard, heavy first pull, the gun would cycle, and then there's your reset. There's a little bit of a bounce off the reset, and your real short, crisp break again. So if you're used to the double action, single action type guns, this is going to behave the same. That first long one, and then after that, very short follow-ups. You do have the option of thumbing the hammer and cocking the gun and manually putting it into that single action mode. The other thing you can do is the safety operates both as a safety and a decocker. When you pull the safety down, it decocks the gun, and normally it would stay in the down position and you would thumb it back up. I did modify this one, and I removed, there's a spring and a ball that you can remove that converts the safety from a safety to a decocker only. I'm really not a fan of mechanical safeties, though on a gun like this a decocker does make a lot of sense. So that conversion makes it perfect. Now it's a decocker, but it doesn't lock down in the safe position. One of the things you'll notice about this is there's the firing pin right now. It's in the fire position and it's ready to fire. The safety, in addition to decocking it, also rotates the firing pin out of the way. So if you do leave this as a safety, when it's in the down position, the firing pin is actually not even parallel, so that it can't fire. And from a decocker perspective, there's absolutely no possibility that if the decocker were to malfunction in some way, because this rotates as part of the turret, that when you're turning it, this has to rotate out of the way in order for this to come down. By the time it decocks, there's no firing pin exposed. So this is an exceptionally safe gun for the DASA type guns, and I'll also show you when I get it apart that it is a drop safe weapon. The sights on it are a fairly nice 3-dot setup, relatively easy to see, and easy to get back on track. They are dovetailed front and rear, but there's a few extra things going on here, and these sights are going to be very proprietary. So replacement sights are going to be probably a little harder to get your hands on than some of the others like the Glocks and the Walthers that are common. Same with the front sight. It is dovetailed. But similar to a 1911, it's a very flush dovetail. because you've got that rounded barrel. Now, one of the things I will tell you about this gun is this thing did not get off to a good start with us. When we picked this up, it was around $350. It really malfunctioned pretty much every magazine. It was very difficult to get through a magazine without it malfunctioning, which really surprised me. I've fired a Beretta Cougar before, and the Beretta Cougar was just flawless. And we did trace it down to the guide rod, and I'll show you some of that when I get it apart. Since we've replaced that, it does actually now work quite well. So, you know, my initial thought was it'd be a fun range gun, which is really what I wanted it for, you know, kind of just looks and range and kind of the appeal of having a, you know, a service type pistol like this. My intent wasn't to carry it or even use it for home defense, but you would find that this is a suitable type of gun for home defense, and if you've got one that once you've got it working correctly, hopefully you don't have the problems that I had with it, it would be suitable for home defense. Though at 32 ounces and 7.2 inches long and just under 5.5 inches tall, it's a little bit large for concealed carry. There's other options out there that are probably a little more suitable to concealed carry. So once I get it apart, I'll describe some of the problems and what went on with it as I work my way through it. So let's go ahead and take this apart. So we start out locking it back, demonstrating that it's clear. You push down. On the back side, there's a little button here. You push this button in, and then on the other side, you can now rotate this lever down. So you'll see that button has two little detents. So now the button, this is in the down position. At this point, it's under spring tension. So grab a hold of the slide, release the slide, and then you just separate the two components. Internally, there's a lot going on in here. There's little levers that stick up, there's components of, this is part of the drop safety, you've got the hammer mechanism, you got some guides over here, and when I show you the slide you'll see there's various grooves and slots that all these things ride in. And that is one of the things that I found with this, is that all of the machining wasn't necessarily smooth. So this little protrusion here is part of the trigger mechanism as well as part of the disconnector mechanism, and that had a tendency to drag against the frame of the gun and hang up, which creates a little bit of friction. Now when you pulled the trigger and everything else, there was enough force there to override that and put it back where it belonged, but what you've got is this cumulative effect of friction here, friction there, kind of added up. This also is part of a guide mechanism, and this was not smooth, and I'll show you where that rides in the slide when I demonstrate the slide. So what I ended up having to do is go through this gun and polish all of the components that brushed against each other. That was the first thing I did while I was trying to diagnose the problems with the gun and try to get it running good. You may or may not have to do that with the one you get. So I wouldn't recommend this for somebody who is new to guns, doesn't have any gunsmithing tools or any skills in that arena. This is a gun that you kind of like some of the 1911s where you may need to spend a little time here and there with it. So it's not necessarily a newbie gun. From a construction standpoint, this is an alloy frame. It is actually nice and solid, it's robust, it's well constructed. The design is solid, it just needed a little bit of polishing. You've got some nice robust front rails and really robust rear rails. So this is designed to last a long time and run quite well over that duration. In the slide, I had mentioned that there was a lot going on in here. You've got grooves along here, grooves along here, as well as the standard guide rails in through here. And the various components that I was showing you on the frame ride in these grooves. And I did find there were a few burrs in here, and I needed to do some polishing in these grooves to smooth it out. When I did all of that, I could actually get it to the point where I would have just the occasional malfunction. Then I got really to the root cause of it. This is a rotating barrel gun, kind of similar to the PX4. This is called the central block, which also acts as what you would consider the locking block. And this rides in a groove on the barrel, I'll show you in a second. And the recoil spring, as you see, goes through it. On the original design of the gun, and this may be a little difficult to show you on camera, but I'm going to try, there's a hole right here in the frame. And in the original design, the guide rod actually sat in that hole. if I can get it lined up in there, it actually sat in like that, and that's how the guide rod was tensioned at the one end, is it would pop into that hole. And then the guide rod would be free through the locking block, and then of course at the other end of the slide. So that's how you got your tension, and that's how it worked. There was really no spring tension whatsoever on the central block. At some point they made an engineering change, and they put a little hook on the central block. And I think part of that may have been getting that guide rod lined up with that little hole when reassembling. It was rather difficult at times because you got things flopping around in there. So this engineering change now put the central block as the locking component, and that's the one half of the tension. So now you do have a tensioned central block. And what I found, I'll pull the central block off and I'll put the original guide rod in. What I found is with that tension with this plastic, it's the polymer guide rod, this plastic guide rod, this would have a tendency to pop up, and you can see right now it's not level, and you have to kind of push it down and it pops back up. So there's some flex in there. And at first I thought, okay, that's just the way it worked, but it was rather difficult to put the gun back together. You'd have to hold this down, because when you tried to slide it into the frame, if you didn't hold it down manually, it would hang up. So you'd have to hold it down and wiggle it to get it to go in. Well, what it turns out is there's too much flex in the polymer guide rod, and that snapping up is actually misaligning the central block and causing it to torque. So I had spoken with Stoeger and done a little bit of research and found that any of these that have the hook on the central block really aren't supposed to be polymer. They're supposed to be the steel guide rods. Now, I'm not somebody that thinks steel guide rods are magic wands that solve, every ill of the world, but in this case it really did, because if you put the steel guide rod back in there, it sits flush, there's no popping up, there's no torquing, it's now smooth. So this is operating now smoothly and freely like the original design was with the guide rod locking to the frame. And you'll notice that once I line it up with the frame, now of course if I do it correctly, I'm going to say this is a little bit difficult at times to get this in there, but when I line it up with the frame it slides in nice and smooth. There's no resistance. So if you do get one of these and it has the polymer guide rod which attaches to the frame, you're probably not going to have any problems with it. If you have the steel guide rod which attaches to the locking block, again, you're probably not going to have any problems with it. But if you have one of this middle generation before they figured that out, where you've got a polymer guide rod attaching to the central block, you're probably going to have trouble. If you do, call Stoeger up. They'll send you a new central block and the guide rod to replace it. So again, once I did that replacement, it now runs nice. It fires well. The weight of it handles recoil exceptionally well. And let me go ahead and show you the barrel. I've played around with the central block and the guide rod. So again, here's your central block. And you can see there's a little protrusion on it. Rides in this groove on the barrel. And you'll see I can rotate the barrel. So what this does is, instead of lifting and tilting like a standard Browning type action, this barrel rotates back and forth. And that's how it feeds the next round. And it also does a really good job of absorbing the recoil. That rotating action eats a lot of that twisting energy that recoil typically has. Removing the barrel is fairly easy. And you'll see here's the lugs that sit into the frame. This will be real difficult to see because everything's black in here, but there's two polished areas right there and right there. This rides in, and it also rides on a polished area at the front of the frame. So the barrel slides in, and that gives you basically the bearing surfaces for rotating this. I have also found, and you can probably tell by looking at it, that this gun does run better wet. Lightly oiling a few drops here and there really doesn't cover it for this particular mechanism. And from a feed perspective, if you see the barrel, look at the front of it, you can see that there's an area where it's thinner. That's actually the feed ramp. And that will rotate into position when the gun is open and ready to accept another round, and then rotates out when it's ready to fire. So that you don't have your typical feed ramp on the barrel. The other mating surface of the feed ramp is there on the frame, which did not come polished from the factory. I polished it as part of trying to debug it, and did find that polishing this up with just some polishing compound and a Q-tip, no machines involved, did make it run a lot better. So let's go ahead and put this back together. To put it back together, you drop the barrel in, and you want to get it where that groove is facing up. Then you take the little protrusion end of the guide rod, you'll see the other end is flat, and you slide it into the central block and it catches on that hook. Now if you've got the older version of it, then it'll just pass back and forth freely through the central block and you'll be lining it up on the frame. The easiest way to reinstall this is to put the nose end in, put the locking block on the barrel, and then just push forward on it until you feel it catch. And basically what's happened is you've ended up finding the point where the protrusion on the bottom of the central block and the barrel lined up. And if you push it back and forth, you should be able to see the barrel rotating. At that point, you've got it properly installed, and then you just want to tilt it so it's kind of roughly center. Doesn't, you don't want it one side or the other, or you'll have a hard time putting it into the frame. So you want it basically roughly center. So once you've got this centered, it's fairly easy to slide it back on. One of the things I do notice is that unlike some of the Glocks and some of the others where you just kind of lay it on the frame, it actually needs to sit just a hair above the frame. So sometimes as you're going to slide it back in, if you've got it lined up wrong, you may have a hard time, so you notice I had to wiggle it quite a bit, and I finally found that spot where it slid in. So if it doesn't slide in easy, you've got to kind of torque a little bit and just back off and slide it on there gently. It should slide on very smoothly like you're seeing, and unless you've got that issue that I had with the polymer guide rod and the wrong locking block, you won't have to do anything with the central block, it'll just slide in. Lock it back, and then we're going to flip this back up. Now one of the things I'll show you now that I don't have anything loose in here, this is the button. It looks like there's two buttons. This is really a pin that's part of a pivot assembly. This is the button right here that you're pushing to release that, and you just give it a little push, enough that you can slide this up, which is a little bit difficult to do when I'm trying to do it for the camera. You push it and then just slide this back up. You'll see there's a detent here and here, and that locks this in place. So when you've got it up, it'll stay up. There's no risk whatsoever when you're operating the gun of accidentally flipping the takedown lever. And the same thing when you have it in the takedown position, it's going to stay there till you're done. Release the slide and you're ready to go. The slide does operate quite smoothly. Especially now that I've polished everything and I've actually put several hundred rounds through the gun at this point. You will hear a little bit of sound as that spring slides through that central block. But overall, I do think it's a well-constructed gun. I kind of don't want to sound like I was negative. I did have a little trouble with it, but we've gotten that resolved, and I do think it's a well-constructed gun. I still might think that this wouldn't necessarily be a good choice for a newbie, somebody who's just getting into firearms, doesn't have any experience with them. I can't say that yours would have the same issues. I might have just gotten unlucky enough to get one of the few guns that were built in that interim period between the types of locking blocks or central blocks. But overall, for somebody that's looking for a service pistol type gun like this and has some experience with firearms and could deal with those issues should they occur, I think it's an excellent gun. If you're really new to firearms, you might want to look at something else that has, a little less complexity to it, a little less going on, and possibly less likelihood of having to do work on it. For example, something like this Walther Ppq. This is a Walther Ppq chambered in 45, and it is unloaded. And this also makes a good size comparison. If I set this up next to the Walther Ppq, you'll see that they're roughly the same size. The PPQ is just a little bit longer, but not significantly in the barrel, and roughly the same height, within fractions of an inch. Now the PPQ is a striker-fired gun. The Stoeger, of course, is, it's a hammer, DAO, SAO hammer. But this kind of gives you an idea of the size territory it's in, and depending on what you're looking for and what you're shopping for, the PPQ may be a better suitable for you, or, the DASA, service pistol type gun that the Stoeger represents might be a good choice as well. Overall, I'm looking forward to having some fun with this gun, enjoying it at the range. With the weight of it and that rotating barrel, it's like shooting a .22 when you fire it. from a recoil perspective. It's very pleasant to shoot and a very, very nice trigger. So hang on for some more range footage. If you like our videos, give us a thumbs up, share, subscribe. Have a great day. Thank you.
Drop it in. Push everything else either like a skull or a girl. This heat. You see it? I only had it at 20, 15 yards.